Let's dive right into this explainer and look at a huge question that basically defines the world we live in today. How exactly was the entire modern world structurally designed to rely on just one single nation? Today, we're going to explore the fascinating, step-by-step way the United States completely transformed itself. It went from a country that really just wanted to be left alone to the undisputed architect of the global order. And here's the crazy part. It wasn't an accident. It was an absolute masterclass in strategy, built on three very specific pillars that we're going to break down for you. So let's start with a massive historical paradox. If you looked at the US in the 1930s, you'd see a nation heavily scarred by the First World War and the Great Depression. The prevailing mood was strict isolationism. Prominent figures fought tooth and nail to keep the US out of international conflicts. They just wanted domestic prosperity, right? No global entanglements. But seemingly out of nowhere, within just a few years, America wasn't just engaged with the world, they literally held the globe's purse strings. So how does a pivot that massive actually happen?
Well, think about how fast this shifted. In 1930, you have the Hawley-Smoot Tariff, which was basically a giant protectionist wall around the American economy. But jump forward to 1941, and an ideological seed is planted. Then, by 1944, before World War II is even officially over, the global economic rules are completely rewritten at Bretton Woods. And by 1948, the U.S. is literally paying to rebuild Europe through the Marshall Plan. In under 2 decades, the United States executed a complete, top-to-bottom blueprint for global dominance. The spark for this incredible pivot actually traces back to one specific document. A recent analysis by researcher Ricky Chen looks at a famous 1941 editorial in Life magazine by Henry Luce. It was titled The American Century. Now, Luce was a massive media magnate, often called the most influential private citizen in America at the time, and he vehemently argued against isolationism, claiming America had a moral obligation to be the, quote, Good Samaritan of the entire world. He basically laid the ideological groundwork for what later became known as an empire by invitation. But as our sources point out, Luce's vision contained this really fascinating dual narrative. On one hand, you have the benevolent leader trope, this idea of a multilateral world order rooted in democracy, human rights, and cooperation. But right alongside it, almost hidden in plain sight, was a clear blueprint for a global hegemon. This side aggressively paved the way for American dominance through cultural imperialism and economic suasion. And this dualism, cooperation, mask, and control, is the exact tightrope the U.S. has been walking ever since.
Section 1. The Bank. Fixing the global economy. Okay, so how did they actually build this economic trap? In July 1944, delegates from 44 allied nations met at the Mount Washington Hotel in Bretton Woods. The goal was to rebuild the international economic system. But the United States came to the table holding a massive trump card. They controlled 2/3 of the entire world's gold. Because they had that leverage, they insisted that instead of creating a neutral global currency, the world would peg their currencies to the US dollar, and the dollar would be tied to gold at $35 an ounce. Practically overnight, the dollar became the universal reserve currency. And it's crucial to understand that the institutions created to manage this new system, like the IMF and the World Bank, weren't just neutral financial tools. As economist Joseph Stiglitz points out, they were highly ideological bodies. For over 70 years, they've been central to spreading a very clear political ideology: capitalism and market fundamentalism. Plus, the voting structures of these institutions heavily favored the U.S., basically matching influence directly with financial contributions. But having the reserve currency doesn't really help you if the rest of the world is too broken to actually buy your goods, right? Enter the European Recovery Program, much better known as the Marshall Plan. Starting in 1948, the U.S. poured a staggering $13.3 billion, which is about $137 billion in today's money, into 17 different European countries. Officially, the goal was to rebuild war-torn regions, modernize their industries, and stop the spread of communism. But here is the ultimate Trojan horse statistic, and it perfectly shows the sheer genius of this economic design. According to the U.S. Congressional Research Service, a massive 83% of those recovery funds were actually spent right back inside the United States. Since European nations had totally exhausted their foreign exchange reserves, they used Marshall Plan grants to buy much-needed staples, fuel, and machinery directly from American corporations. So it wasn't just charity. It was an incredible stimulus package for the U.S. economy that basically locked in European economic dependency on American exports. Moving on to Section 2, the brand, soft power, and Coca-Colanization. Once that economic foundation was set, the United States started exporting its lifestyle. And Henry Luce predicted this cultural sweep perfectly back in his 1941 essay. He wrote that American jazz, Hollywood movies, American slang, American machines were becoming the common language of the globe. He realized that exporting pop culture was just as powerful, maybe even more powerful, than exporting heavy machinery. It created a world that didn't just rely on American goods, but actively craved the American way of life.
This phenomenon became so completely ubiquitous that it actually earned its own term, Coca-Colanization. This is the globalization of American culture pushed through consumer products like Coca-Cola and Levi's jeans. To a lot of post-war Europeans, Coke wasn't just a fizzy drink, it was literally bottled America. Democracy, capitalism, and consumerism were all packaged together and sold globally. So wherever the US couldn't reach with foreign policy, it reached with a soda bottle. Now, not everyone was thrilled with this massive cultural tidal wave. In 1949, the French Communist Party fiercely opposed the expansion of Coca-Cola, and they even issued this super dramatic warning. They claimed the Coke distribution system would double as an American espionage network. While that definitely sounds extreme to us today, it does neutrally highlight the very real, very intense nationalist anxiety that countries felt as their local cultures were seemingly getting paved over by American soft power.
Interestingly enough, this cultural shift had profound physical consequences too. Medical literature today actually uses the term Coca-Colonization to describe a global nutritional crisis. Along with movies and music, the U.S. exported processed foods, stuff high in trans fats and refined sugars, to developing nations. This prompted a massive transition away from traditional diets and survival methods, leading directly to a spike in chronic lifestyle diseases, most notably type 2 diabetes. So the American brand quite literally physically reshaped global health. And that brings us to Section 3, the BRON, Military-Industrial Complex and Oil. To actually enforce this new global order, you need physical muscle. Following World War II, the Cold War prompted the U.S. to transition away from a mentality of mass production reliant on public volunteers to a privatized, highly centralized defense industry. This deeply interconnected relationship between the government and private contractors created a military-industrial complex that exerts a huge influence on how other nations formulate their own security policies. I mean, think about it. When you depend on American weaponry and logistics, your domestic and international security agendas are inevitably going to align with Washington. To really put the sheer scale of this brawn into perspective, consider this stat. By 2008, the American defense budget had grown so massive that it actually exceeded the aggregate budgets of the next 8 highest-spending nations combined. We are talking about outspending Russia, Japan, France, the UK, Germany, Italy, and Saudi Arabia, all put together. This cemented the U.S. as the undisputed leader in major defense technologies, making them a permanent, visible partner in the international relations of pretty much every modern democracy. Meanwhile, the flow of oil basically became the dark blood of the modern state. You simply can't have an industrial economy or a functional military without it. The U.S. deeply understood that global power meant securing the volatile geographic choke points where this energy flowed, places like the Persian Gulf, the Strait of Malacca, the Arctic, and the South China Sea. These aren't just random locations on a map, they are high-stakes geopolitical board games where controlling the supply translates directly into raw political influence. But recently, that dynamic completely flipped, all thanks to internal American innovation. The U.S. shale revolution, which was driven by hydraulic fracturing and horizontal drilling, transformed the United States from a massive importer heavily dependent on the Middle East into both the world's largest consumer and its most prolific producer of oil. This newfound abundance gave the U.S. totally unprecedented diplomatic flexibility. Now, American energy exports can fill supply gaps worldwide, allowing Washington to weaponize energy policy via sanctions against adversaries while simultaneously offering energy lifelines to its allies. The balance, a double-edged hegemony. So bringing it all together, we can see that this reliance on America isn't just some political coincidence. It's an empire by invitation, built systematically over decades on banks, brands, and brawn. Which leaves us with a really critical question for our future. As we watch global alliances fracturing today and see new economic blocs forming, we have to ask ourselves, are we witnessing the sunset of this global dependency? Or is the American century simply evolving its rules for a brand new era? Thanks for exploring this with me on This Explainer, and definitely keep questioning the structures around you.